Right, let's talk about grief, which is sometimes can be an uncomfortable subject, but one that we need to talk about. So, Amanda, what is grief to you?
Grief is usually some sort of expression of loss, I think, where you feel that things are difficult, maybe too difficult, and you can be overwhelmed by feelings, by your emotions associated with the loss of whatever it is that you're grieving about. I think one of the things that I found interesting through my sort of experience has been that sometimes you experience grief and you don't recognize it as such. So, for instance, when my oldest son moved out of home and I had that sort of empty nest syndrome, they call it, I didn't recognise that I was actually grieving that
Wow.
change. So there was no
Yeah.
real loss, but it was just a change of circumstances, and that was grief, and that was how it manifests within me. So it can take all sorts of different forms, and I think that's the nice thing about opening up the subject, is to kind of make it more approachable for people to talk about.
Yeah, that's interesting actually. And I think, yeah, you're right. I think there's so many levels of grief.
Yes. Yeah.
That's
But I think we talked about apathy last week, didn't we? Where it was a
yeah,
feeling of hopelessness. I think with
yeah,
grief, because it's above apathy on the scale, I think grief, there is an aspect of hope that you can get help and that you'll get out of this and time will heal and all the things that we hear about grief to try
yeah.
and help us through it.
For me, when you say the word grief, and I know there's different types of grief, but I just think of black.
Yeah.
That's the
Well,
first thing that comes to my mind, black and dark.
I think it is very normal for us to think of death as closely associated with grief. And I think, that's the large part of our discussion, which we'll have on LinkedIn Live. But I think it's more about acknowledging that there are certain points in your life where you will grieve, but you won't necessarily have lost anything. You might have changed things. But one of the things that we've been talking about is that grief is often due to attachment. That's where its psychological basis is in attachment. So we've attached ourselves to something or someone, and that's no longer with us, either through death or change of circumstances. And
Is
so
that
we
called
grieve.
grief as well then? Yeah, okay. Wow.
Yeah,
So it's adapting.
yeah,
Can be
yeah.
adapting as well. I think the important thing about it, whatever kind of grief it is to talk about it. At least have somebody to talk about it with.
Yes.
And that's why we
And
do these
also,
conversations anyway, isn't it?
yeah,
Because it's good to talk about everything. Not to, I mean, you have to be careful who you talk to, but
yeah, of
it's so
course.
important to talk.
But I think even more important than that, we would both acknowledge as well, is to process that emotion that you feel,
Yeah,
because a large proportion of grief is suppressed.
yeah,
And it's known that can then cause physiological problems in your body, because if you suppress it, you're pushing this emotion down and it causes all sorts of problems within. So what interesting thing I was reading in the David Hawkins book was saying that grief, you need 10 to 20 minutes to express it, to
wow.
allow that emotion to pass through
Which
you.
seems like an eternity if you're that
If you're
grief.
feeling it,
If you're feeling
yeah,
that grief, that would be
a
a
long
very
time.
uncomfortable 20 minutes. But imagine after the 20
Yeah.
minutes and then it's gone, and then you can just obviously not move on completely, but that's a great start, isn't it?
It's progression, isn't it? That's the way. And I
Progression,
think that's,
exactly.
we don't see that. We see it as weakness, or it has been perceived, particularly in men, as weakness. And yet what they don't see is if they allow themselves to cry or to process it in whatever way they need to process it, to the extent that it's actually then passed through them and the feeling is gone, temporarily or otherwise,
Yeah.
then actually they've opened up themselves to being much more than they could possibly ever been before. Because I certainly feel like grief has given me huge compassion for other people,
Oh yeah. And
and
you understand things
experiencing it makes your understanding
in
is
a whole new way, And yeah, I forgot what I was going to say, but
because there are so many emotions that come up as associated with grief, like anger and sadness. I mean, and depression as well. There are all sorts of aspects to grief, and you know, they do say that there's like 9 phases of grief, and whether you
9.
subscribe to that
Is
or
there
not,
9?
yeah.
What are they? Do you know what they are?
I think there's denial is one of the first ones,
Oh yeah,
isn't it?
denial. Yeah.
It goes in through sort of
Yeah.
anger, and then you know, there can be guilt. Guilt is another one. A lot of people feel guilty, and so
what you're saying
it's
about processing that in 20 minutes, do you mean all 9 phases?
No, just the emotion that's coming up for you. So
at the moment,
mostly when it's original. Like I know we were talking in the post about the LinkedIn live. You were saying that, you know, when your dad died, it was shock, and so
shock was horrendous.
What that does is it causes a delay to that grieving process, because you're still processing what the hell has just happened.
Yeah, and I think that detaches you from the feelings.
Yes.
Yeah. And maybe it's your body's way of coping with it, I think.
Yes, I think it is.
Yeah. You can be in shock for a long time. But anyway, we're going to talk more about this on my page now. So if you you can watch the replay on my LinkedIn. And yes, that's it, isn't it, Amanda?
Yeah, and we will see you soon. But yeah, just join us on LinkedIn if you can. We're there at 1:30 every Monday, and that's UK time.
4:30 Dubai time. Right, see you there.
See you then.